This is part 2 of what is probably going to be an intermittent and indefinite series of videos, exploring ancient people's knowledge of the past and broadly exploring the question of, did ancient civilizations have their own ancient civilizations? Like, what did they think about ruins, or artifacts they might have come into contact with, or old documents, things of that nature. In part 1, we primarily took a look at Neo-Babylonian perceptions of the deeper Mesopotamian past and their archaeological digs. In this video, we're going to take a different approach and examine the folklore surrounding stone tools, mainly Paleolithic Handaxes, and how they were used by cultures hundreds of thousands of years after those artifacts were first made, and what they thought these things, which we today recognize as evidence of Stone Age man, and of earlier archaic humans like Homo erectus, actually were. Fair warning though, this is a longer, more jam-packed video, so you might want to put this on in the background or grab a drink while you watch this. So, in folklore and in myth, these Handaxes went by, broadly, 3 names. Thunderstones, lightning stones, and Suraunia, a Latin word essentially meaning thunderstone. And the 3 are interchangeable, but if you read a book or a paper on folklore, you will normally see thunderstone, whereas if you were to read an academic text on the subject, which we'll get into later in the video, you'll normally see the Latin word, because that was the language most often used prior to the middle of the 19th century to write scholarly treatises. And, generally speaking, although Handaxes are the primary form that thunderstones took, people also classified arrowheads, spear points, and other stone tools under that name as well. But primarily, these are stone axes. Now that being said, I just want to get one thing out of the way. Fossils were also sometimes classified as thunderstones, but fossils are not going to be covered in this video because that topic is so big it essentially requires one of its own. So, as the name suggests, it was believed that these stones appeared where lightning had struck the earth, and they have a history of at least 2,000 years of being inserted into the rafters of buildings in the belief that, because they were formed by lightning, they actually could ward off lightning bolts that could potentially strike buildings. And we also have examples of smaller Handaxes and projectile points being worn as amulets, evidently for healing purposes, which we know because we have, for example, thunderstone amulets with Greek inscriptions attempting to protect or heal the person wearing it. Now, I know someone's going to bring this up in the comments, and yes, these are also useful for evolving Pikachu into Raichu. And, actually, when I was looking for a good image of that Pokemon to put into this video, I came across this zombie Pikachu, which I absolutely love, and since Halloween has just passed, I figured it fits. Anyway, this was a really, really fun topic to research, and I hope you enjoy listening to this as much as I enjoyed doing it. So, to talk about this folk belief and how it impacted notions of the past, how people thought about history, and then how that belief gradually declined. After all, we recognize these things as Paleolithic Handaxes and other stone tools now, and not mysterious objects generated by lightning bolts. We have to discuss, well, obviously Handaxes and why they were made, but also where these beliefs are distributed, and then tie in the early history of archaeology, and also talk about the history of magic and cultural anthropology. These all sort of mesh together when it comes to this particular subject. So let's start with magic. After all, if these were considered to be talismans and protective charms, then the idea of magic is going to be pretty important. This is an extremely complex subject, and just so we're all on the same page here, in trying to write this section of the script and condense this discussion into a few paragraphs for a YouTube video, I'm largely drawing on Matteo Benussi's excellent article on the subject in the Open Encyclopedia of Anthropology, which is a somewhat condensed online version of the Cambridge Encyclopedia of Anthropology, and very, very broadly the work of 2 historians, Carlo Ginzburg and Ronald Hutton, who we'll come back to in a few minutes, but if you want a long, in-depth discussion of everything we're about to cover, that's where you want to go. So, magic. If you hear the word, you immediately have a wide array of images pop into your brain. Everything from stage magicians performing tricks that we know are fake and that we know have explanations, to the satanic panic of the 1980s and notions of the occult and devil worship, to New Age religions and modern reconstructions of paganism, to more fantasy-esque type things like the magic system in the Elder Scrolls or Dungeons and Dragons, to card games like Magic the Gathering. I tend to run a blue-black deck, my wife runs red-green, and she beats me almost every time. So the word sometimes has negative connotations to it. Ideas of cultural or societal primitiveness, and it sometimes evokes images of the exotic, playing with dark forces beyond the realm of human understanding. And it's this negative connotation that actually helps kickstart anthropology as an academic discipline. The later 19th century, to kind of steal the title of an excellent book written by Eric Hobsbawm on the subject, indeed an excellent trilogy on the 19th century, is sometimes called the Age of Empire. And it's the era not only when Europeans and their descendants, like the Americans, and their imitators, like the Japanese, established control over vast swaths of territory, notably Africa and much of Asia, and established colonies, but it's also the era when empire became popular in a manner that it wasn't previously. So what do I mean by this, and how does this tie into magic? There are a number of reasons why Western powers engaged in what's called New Imperialism. One of the major factors in the desire for colonies was basically exploitation of natural resources and the establishment of markets. We shouldn't beat around the bush here or try to downplay that. Colonialism was an extremely destructive process, with one of the worst examples probably being the administration set up in the Congo by the Belgians, and it did economically damage a lot of areas, sometimes pretty severely. But, as the historian Richard Evans points out in The Struggle for Power, this was also the age of intense nationalism and racism. This was the period when world fairs featured human zoos, for example. What he's trying to point out in that section of the book, and it's my reason for bringing this up here in a discussion of magic, is that part of the justification for these empires and for these colonies in the late 19th century was the belief in colonial powers having a civilizing mission. It was the job of the white man to civilize and Christianize more primitive, non-white peoples, and this is generally called the white man's burden. Empire, in part, became popular in the home countries due to this idea of uplifting others that were considered savage, and it also helped boost national prestige. And it's here that we come back to magic, because when colonial administrators and missionaries and educators went to these newly established colonies, what they were encountering were cultures that had their own religions and their own belief sets, which made sense to them and their culture, but that did not make sense to Europeans. To Europeans, what they were witnessing were less advanced, primitive beliefs. So early anthropologists took an interest in this sort of thing, and they began to study it. This is where terms like shamanism, or totems, or totemic, or fetishism enter standard vocabulary, and it forms a huge subculture in late 19th and early 20th century media. There are occult revivals and books and eventually films that take this sort of thing as their general plotline. Now, in trying to study this, early anthropologists started to divide and hierarchize belief sets, and this broadly took the form of what's called in anthropology unilinear evolution. It's a 19th century attempt to categorize societies along lines of complexity. It's where the notion of progressing from simple primitivism to complex civilization comes from, and it's done along a set path where cultures proceed from bands to tribes to chiefdoms to civilizations and states, and belief systems were attached to this, so magic became a very primitive belief set, whereas religion was a highly evolved, complex set of beliefs, in some instances becoming an ideology to support divine kingship, and then, in this line of thinking, you eventually pass religion entirely and you arrive at science. It was the job of early anthropologists to document this process and thus help gather information on how to uplift these various cultures. But as anthropology continued to develop as a discipline, the notion of magic and what constitutes magic and its opposition to religion was almost completely reworked, and anthropologists arrived at a much more nuanced understanding of the subject, which then allows us to talk about things like thunderstones and how people thought about them and why they did. So, what happens? Well, basically, what happens is that anthropologists actually start doing work out in the field. today, if you are interested in anthropology and you pursue any sort of degree in the discipline, at some point you're going to have to go do field work and probably conduct an ethnography, a type of cultural research that requires the anthropologist in question to go directly study the culture or group of people that's being investigated, and it relies heavily on participant observation, and it also requires them to be cognizant of the fact that, oftentimes, the anthropologist does not come from the culture being studied, and the potential to misunderstand something could very well happen. Late 19th century anthropologists, generally speaking, didn't really do this, or at least not to the degree that they should have. What usually occurred was that people interested in the study of other cultures gathered facts and information from other first or second-hand sources. In other words, they weren't talking to the cultures in question themselves, and then they were writing about and categorizing these facts derived from other sources. The result are books like James Fraser's The Golden Bough. Now, this early work is still useful because it laid the foundation for broad categories of magic, and it helped tease out themes and motifs in myths and folklore like agricultural gods and birth, death, rebirth deities, but actual fieldwork and time spent with cultures that practiced magic shifted anthropological interest from here's why this is primitive nonsense to here's why this culture believes what they do and how this culture operates. One of the major reasons that this shift occurs is because Bronislaw Malinowski, an anthropologist who was conducting ethnographic research around New Guinea, didn't exactly get stuck there, quote-unquote, but he had Austro-Hungarian citizenship, and the British made it very difficult for him to leave because World War I had broken out, and technically he was an enemy citizen. So he's there doing extended field work for several years, way longer than he had intended, and his writings formed something like a how-to for conducting participant observation research. The end result of all of these changes in research techniques is that anthropologists now have a much more nuanced understanding of what constitutes magic. So what is that? Essentially, after all of this research is done, in anthropology, magic is commonly understood to be a set of activities and technologies intended to manipulate invisible or immaterial agencies and energies not recognized by science to an advantageous end. This shift in understanding has made it abundantly clear that magic is one of those things that appears to be almost ubiquitous in human culture. In the 1990s, there was this great paper published, and you can still read it today, called Baseball Magic, written by an anthropologist named George Gemlich. And it basically looks at rituals and superstitions in baseball, beliefs that you should not change a dirty uniform because you've won games while wearing it, having a lucky glove, twisting your hat and making a hand sign before throwing the first pitch, that sort of thing. And it makes it clear that this is, from an anthropologist's viewpoint, a modern, secularized form of magic. Baseball players are attempting to manipulate the game. The same thing goes for little kids doing something like flushing ice cubes down the toilet or wearing those socks inside out, stuff along those lines, in the hopes of waking up to a snow day. The subject of this video, thunderstones, very much falls under this conception of magic, specifically a form called Apotropaic magic. So, Apotropaic magic is a type of magic that is basically practiced with the aim or intention of trying to protect or reduce or remove harm from something or someone. It's a very broad classification of magic, basically because when you're talking about protective magic, it covers everything from good luck charms and amulets to putting up a talisman in your house, to carving jack-o'-lanterns or gargoyles or some other frightening image to scare away malevolent entities, to knocking on wood and crossing your fingers so you don't jinx something, to whistling while walking past a graveyard. I know someone is probably thinking about this particular example, given that I'm releasing this around Halloween, and the answer is yes, hanging up cloves of garlic to repel vampires does fit into this category. Thunderstones come into play here because they were used as talismans to protect against lightning strikes by being placed on rafters or inserted into walls or the foundations of buildings, and as we'll see later in this video, they were also used for medicine and to induce childbirth. So let's talk about these Handaxes then, and how ancient people thought about the deep past when they encountered them. Stone Handaxes are one of the longest used tools in history, probably it's the longest continuously used tool if we're being perfectly honest. The amazing thing about these, though, at least to me, is that they might potentially not actually be tools. They might have had a different purpose, or at least a secondary purpose. So, the Paleolithic, or Old Stone Age, spans approximately 3.3 million years ago to approximately 20,000 years ago, although the exact dividing line between the Paleolithic and the Mesolithic, or Middle Stone Age, does vary depending on the location, and it varies by thousands of years. And there are even places where it appears that the Middle Stone Age was just not a thing, and that the Paleolithic transitioned right into the Neolithic. The point I'm trying to raise, though, is that the Paleolithic constitutes the bulk of human history, marked by the development and the extensive use of stone-based technologies. It is an absolutely massive period of time, and because it's so long, it's normally subdivided based on the type of technology used. These are typically known as industries or lithic industries, and they refer to the techniques of knapping employed to produce those tools. When it comes to hand axes, the lithic industry is generally known as Acheulean, taking its name from the type site of Saint Acheulean in France, but their actual distribution is much, much wider than just France. This type of artifact fits into a somewhat broader classification of lithic technology that archaeologists call bifaces. It refers to a type of tool that has two sides, or faces, hence biface, which has been worked into a cutting edge, and this type of technology is found across basically all of Africa, with the oldest hand axes we know of being found at the Oldowan Gorge in Ethiopia and which date to about 1.6 million years ago, and they also show up in the Middle East, India, and of course Europe by the Acheulean period, about 1.95 to 0.13 million years ago, when this type of technology and its associated industry was predominant. That age range, and the end of the Acheulean period, by the way, is not necessarily clearly defined, means that hand axes were used not only by anatomically modern humans, Homo sapiens, but also by older archaic humans like Homo erectus. At one point, it wasn't thought that these were used in the rest of Eurasia, but there have been a number of finds in China, Korea, and in Java, and there are a few that have been found in Australia, so evidently they were produced and used, but as of right now, the archaeological evidence very strongly suggests that their use predominated in Europe and in Africa, but that can always be revised if we find more of these tools. Updating the research happens all the time. It's because of that distribution pattern and the amount of not only archaeological data on hand axes and stone tools, but the volume of mythology and folklore surrounding them that has come down to us in the present day that this video is essentially going to focus on thunderstone folklore in Europe. But, that being said, these sorts of topics, what did ancient people know or think about the past, what did they think old stone tools like hand axes were, is there any truth preserved in folklore and mythology, etc., is pretty much a bottomless pit in terms of research, and hand axes themselves are a big topic, so while this video is focusing on European folklore surrounding thunderstones, there will likely be a secondary one dealing with other parts of the globe. Now, I mentioned a moment ago that hand axes might not have been used as tools per se, so let's explore this. The most important thing to understand about hand axes, I think, is that they can very much be used as tools. These are edged implements, and they do cut, and they cut very effectively. There was, back in the 1990s, a test done to see how well a hand axe could do that job. One of these bifaces was given to a butcher to chop up a cow, and it was basically like putting a hot knife through butter. It was so effective that this actually split the bone and exposed the marrow. But there were other stone tools that could be used to hunt animals and butcher meat, both with one and two faces, like choppers and knives. And when they're compared to the hand axe stands out due to the complexity of its manufacture. These can absolutely be held in the hand, hence the term, but the problem with this idea is that it seems sort of dangerous. Unlike, say, a chopper or some other tool with a very clearly defined blade, the hand axe usually has a blade running all around it, so holding it could potentially injure the user, and because tests have demonstrated that these things can easily butcher an animal and expose the marrow, it's entirely possible that the degree of the injury will be severe. Unless, of course, it was perhaps being held with leather or some other form of protective barrier between the hand and the top of the blade, but then again there have been axes found without blades in the section where it would be held. There's another idea, and it's not really well supported because tests have been conducted and it just doesn't really seem to work well, that these were like a Paleolithic form of a killer frisbee, in which the hand axe was thrown at an animal, or potentially other humans, with the intention of scoring a kill for the hunt, or maybe at the very least stunning the target, because at the end of the day this is still a stone, and being hit with a stone, even if it doesn't administer a cut, is going to hurt. It's taken off and sort of developed its own popular mythology, but the killer frisbee idea isn't really advocated by archaeologists, because attempts to throw the hand axe have demonstrated that, on the one hand, it's not really aerodynamic. Like, for example, there's a reason that Paleolithic man developed technology like the atlatl, and on the other hand, when the hand axe is successfully thrown, it sort of just falls to the ground without the blade doing much damage. So, if the aim is to stun or kill an animal while hunting, just, throw an unworked stone. And then there's the more interesting idea, which is that hand axes were used to help secure mates. And I really, really want to emphasize that while I do find this idea interesting, and that this is actually the way hand axes were first introduced to me when I was like 15, that this is just an idea. It is a very controversial idea, with its own supporters, people who are sort of on board, and some people who emphatically reject it. So, what is this? Well, there are some hand axes that are unusually large, like over 30 or 40 centimeters in length when compared to other hand axes, and there are some that are unusually small, like 5 centimeters or smaller, and these tend to be symmetrical, and we know from modern tests where archaeologists have created stone tools that the level of complexity on some of these hand axes blows the other tools out of the water. Some of these hand axes that have survived are actually made of bone, while some others, such as this one found in England, and I have to issue a correction here. In the community post I did teasing this video, I stated that this was Bulgarian. That's a mistake on my end, and I was getting it confused with another example. Are formed around a fossil. Stone tools can and do break, especially if you are not experienced in doing any sort of knapping. If you strike the core in the wrong area while attempting to remove a flake of stone, that core, or whatever it is you are working, could just break. So, because there are some very nice looking hand axes, such as the one with the fossil, the hypothesis has been advanced that maybe it's to demonstrate that you're such a successful hunter that you're able to provide for a mate, and you have excess time to make superfluous items out of stone. It also could explain hand axes that are too small or too big to be used as a tool when there are other simpler lithics like basic choppers or scrapers. It's to secure mates. No matter the exact function of these things, ultimately what we're talking about are artifacts whose construction and then use dates back to over 1 million years in the case of the hand axe, and then other stone tools like arrow and spearheads, which are younger than those hand axes. Date rows being tweaked as more evidence is found, but the oldest stone arrowheads date to something like 74,000 years ago in Ethiopia. So then we come to the central question. How did ancient, and actually medieval and early modern people come to understand these objects, and when did the switch in the mental framework happen that led them to realize that these were tens or hundreds of thousands, if not over 1 million, years old? Our best early evidence, that is to say when we have writing explicitly telling us that hey, there are these stones and this is what we think they are, comes from the Roman period, although we do have some sparser evidence for regions of Europe that didn't really have writing, at least not that we know of, but which definitely saw hand axes and stone tools as being special. So how were these things found in the first place? Well, there doesn't really, at least to my knowledge, and it didn't really come up in the research I did for this video, appear to be a clear-cut answer to this. Given the continual find of stone tools in the modern day, 28 flint hand axes were found in a section of the North Sea that was dredged several years ago, for example, and there are plenty of TikToks and YouTube videos of people finding arrowheads in stream beds and in the woods, for example. It's very likely that they were just located over time. There are reports from early modern Italy, which we'll return to later in this video, that what eventually come to be recognized as projectile points were apparently just abundant in the Italian hillside, and there are other recorded instances of people actually digging them up at the sites of lightning bolts hitting the ground. But generally, people thought these appeared where lightning had struck, hence the term thunder or lightning stone. There is no evidence that ancient people thought these things were older stone tools. Everything we have points to supernatural beliefs about these items up until about the 17th century, although they become supernatural items with a deep past of their own, which we'll talk about later in this video. The earliest mention we have of this belief comes from a Greek writer named Sotakis, who wrote a book on thunderstones and who evidently noticed that these thunderstones were somewhat similar in shape and size to metal axes, and that they generally came in three varieties. The first are black, and they could be used for supernatural purposes like attacking enemy ships. The second are red, and while he doesn't list any sort of power associated with the red ones, he simply calls them thunderstones. He does list a third variety, the color of which isn't said, but which are supposed to be remarkably powerful in terms of magic, and because of this, they're sought for at places where lightning had struck the ground by people looking to use the power of these stones in order to ward off lightning strikes on buildings. We have very little of Sotakis' writing that survives. We don't even know when he lived. Our only real information about him comes to us from the writing of Pliny, who cites him, as recorded in the Natural History, but he does tell us that Sotakis is one of his oldest sources for this particular thing, so it's hypothesized that he maybe lived in the 3rd century BC. So in terms of textual sources, this is the oldest reference that we definitely know about. The belief goes back to at least the Hellenistic era, with the surviving writing starting to appear in the Roman period. For the Romans, and then for the Greeks, that is to say, when we have actual documentation about these stones and not just the physical artifact itself, this is basically the problem. There isn't necessarily a nice linear pathway that you can trace through text and fully examine the origins of the belief in thunderstones. For ancient sources, it's much more scattered. We know that they believe that Handaxes and other tools originated via lightning, but it's not really certain how that belief arose. Two of the most complete sources of information we have on thunderstones and their protective qualities basically leave Pliny behind, and they skip forward a few hundred years, coming to us from the late 400s, so there is a gap when two writers, Timotheus and Demergeron of Acts, the one a Christian philologist and the other an author of a supernatural text on the magical properties of gems, basically tell us the same thing as Sotakis. If you take one of these stones and you put it in a building, it's going to function as a talisman and ward off lightning bolts. It just seems to be something present in Greco-Roman culture. It just appears to be something that was present in Greco-Roman culture. Now, when it comes to the thunderstones themselves, we have a little more information than just these texts, and actually, we have little tiny bits of writing further reinforcing what Sotakis and the others tell us these were used for, because some of the surviving thunderstones have inscriptions on them. But there is a dividing line here. Thunderstones that were inscribed tend to come from the Eastern Mediterranean, while thunderstones that are not inscribed come to us from the Western Mediterranean, and those extend all the way up into the British Isles at Roman sites. As far as the uninscribed axes are concerned, there are two major studies, one conducted in the UK and one conducted in Spain, which examine several dozen stone tools, predominantly axes, and where they were found in the context of Roman buildings that were being excavated. Basically all of them were found either in structures that were once watchtowers, houses, or large buildings like barracks, with the exception of 3 from the UK study which were found near pottery kilns, right where these other texts tell us they should be found. So this is a nice instance of textual and material evidence lining up, which when you're dealing with stuff this old doesn't always happen. We're also able to tell that these were used as talismans to protect against lightning strikes because the same artifacts were found in the exact same contexts from sites in the Eastern Mediterranean, this time with inscriptions explicitly asking them to protect the house. The inscriptions are actually a little puzzling, and for 2 reasons. The first is that, and specialists who study Greek and Roman religion and the magic systems associated with it aren't certain as to why this is, but the inscriptions are in Greek, and they largely only appear in contexts where populations of Greek speakers were high. There are not thunderstones that we know of that have comparable inscriptions in Latin or Aramaic or some other language from the period. It's basically only in Greek. And the other reason that these are puzzling is that the inscriptions appear to draw on any and all sorts of mystical/occult terminology and beings. It is not uncommon to find inscribed thunderstones, for example, with some sort of a solar deity like Mithra or Zeus or Horus or Ra, and then to have the names of Jewish angels listed around that figure or that figure's name. Anything and everything was apparently used to bolster the protective qualities of these items. Handaxes also show up in places where we don't have writing to explain what people thought these were, but which were evidently important to them in some capacity. The town of Alvaldsnes, in southwestern Norway, is a place of incredible historical significance for the Norwegians. It's the place with the oldest ship burial in Scandinavia, dating to the early 700s. It's the place where Håkon the Good fought a battle against the sons of Eric Bloodaxe in 953, and with his victory, became the first king of Norway. It's the site of the burial of the Flag Prince, someone of some degree of importance during the Roman era because that man was buried with Roman items. And it is the site of an early medieval grave which features a Paleolithic axe interred with the woman in said early medieval grave. This actually forms a pattern across early medieval Scandinavia, from the edges of the Norwegian North Sea coast right across to Sweden. In this region, these are probably connected with Thor. So, one of the topics that comes up in academic discussions of Norse mythology is that Thor is part of a series of gods that ultimately derive from an Indo-European pantheon, and if you use comparative mythology, there are other thunder gods that Thor falls into as an Indo-European category. These include, for example, Perrin and Indra and Zeus, but they note that Thor seems to stand out because he appears to be the only thunder god that consistently wields a hammer. The others generally use an axe or an actual lightning bolt, and hammers don't seem to be a weapon in Germanic and Norse myth or folklore. These are the tools of smiths, not warriors. Investigations into this topic eventually lead to thunderstones, because the term thunderbolt was translated from the Greek and Latin into Danish and Norwegian texts in the Middle Ages as Thor's stones or Thor's wedges, and it was believed that these fell to earth. These were the remnants of the thunder that Thor had thrown, and they took the form of Stone Age axes and hammers. It's probably for this reason that archaeologists find them in graves dating to the medieval period. Not only were they considered talismans to protect against lightning strikes, but they were also considered signs of Thor. So now we start really entering the medieval and then the early modern period, when not only the belief in thunderstones and supernatural things of that nature survived, but also when ideas of a deep past very slowly began to be formulated. And just so we're all on the same page here, the beliefs very closely overlap, so I'm going to treat both periods as one for this portion of the video. And it also brings up a related question. If you're talking about folk beliefs in Christian Europe and pagan ideas like thunderstones being evidence for Thor, how did the Christian church feel about this sort of thing? Well, this is where we come back to a historian I mentioned at the start of the video, Carlo Ginzburg. He's an Italian historian who predominantly focuses on a type of research called microhistory, and specifically he's very well known for several books written in the 70s and 80s that drew on Inquisition records kept by the Vatican. So every year around the holidays, you'll typically encounter these memes which try to argue that, for example, Easter is actually a pagan holiday and the term Easter is actually a corruption of the Mesopotamian goddess Ishtar, and it stretches back thousands of years. In other words, Christian holidays are actually pagan and the church stole it. I'm bringing this up because while that itself isn't historically accurate, it sort of draws upon something that is real, which are extremely loose pagan/folk beliefs and customs that get worked into Christianity, and most of Carlo Ginzburg's research deals with this sort of thing. One of his books, The Night Battles, dealt with a group of people called the Benedante, who believed that they could, at certain times of the year, leave their bodies and fight against evil people or beings called Malandante in order to fight in the service of Jesus Christ for a full, bountiful harvest for the year, which the Malandante were attempting to sabotage. Another of his books, The Cheese and the Worms, examined the life of an Italian peasant named Minocchio, who argued, among other things, that it doesn't matter if the church has alms for the dead, because the dead are dead and they're not coming back, and because they are now in the hands of God, it would be better for the church and for humanity to focus on the here and now and, for example, actively attempt to help each other, rather than being so concerned about the afterlife because God is the ultimate judge. Many of the people like this were often burned at the stake during the witch trials in the early modern period, but the point is that there were what we today would consider non-Christian or folk beliefs held by people like this that they saw as entirely consistent with the Christian viewpoint and not blasphemous or pagan. It's this peasanty, folksy blend of ideas that probably enables something like thunderstone talismans to pass into the Christian belief set and find a home within it. So, in the Middle Ages and in the early modern period, thunderstones kept their apotropaic properties, but their provenance eventually got worked into biblical understandings of the universe, and we get a new twist on them. They start being used in medicine to help heal people, in addition to their earlier use in preventing lightning strikes against buildings. In the latter regard, oftentimes they were believed to have been sent by saints in order to help protect those buildings, so this is an example of why I brought up Carlo Ginzburg. When you try to visualize what folk beliefs from a pre-Christian era looked like when they meshed with Christianity, it's basically this. And in the Christian belief set, when Handaxes and stone tools were found that did not immediately accompany a thunderstorm, like if you were just out in the woods and you happened to find one, it was believed to be fallout, like literal fallout from the skies, representing the remnants of the war in heaven when Satan rebelled against God way in the past, way before Eve was tempted by the serpent, and before she and Adam were cast out of Eden. And there have been several studies in different parts of Europe, like Slovakia, for instance. There's actually a lot of these studies for Slovakia specifically for whatever reason, but also the Scandinavian countries, Germany, and France, which, when combined, very strongly suggest that many houses in rural Europe in the late Middle Ages and the early modern period had an axe or something like that, some sort of a thunderstone in the wall or in the chimney or under the foundation to protect the dwelling. So that belief continues. But how are these used in folk medicine? Well, even before the advent of modern scientific medicine, people realized that lymph nodes swell. Skin diseases and problems like eczema were something that afflicted people. Joints ached when it was cold, bones that had broken and had since healed, sometimes still hurt, that sort of thing. Old injuries never really go away. So, in general here, thunderstones were heated up or cooled down by submerging them in cold water and applied to the area or wound in question. 16th and 17th century apothecaries in the German states evidently sold these things as talismans, with the larger thunderstones being used as pestles to grind up medicine, the idea being that because they were divine, and came from either the war in heaven or were sent by saints, ingesting medicine made from such an object or scraping some of the stone off and mixing that into the medicine would endow it with special properties which would enable the medicine to literally crush the disease or the ailment inside the body. And I have to say, I think in the course of doing the research for this video, grinding up stone dust and ingesting it is probably the weirdest thing I came across. There are cases in early modern France and Scotland where kidney stones are said to be healed by wearing one of these talismans on your belt. The list of the supposed benefits of thunderstones is almost endless. They were given to women struggling to give birth in the belief that holding such a divine object would actually induce childbirth, and if it was successful, that thunderstone would be placed in the newborn's cradle. There is even one account from Prussia of a cow who evidently had blood in its udders, and thus in the milk, having its udders stuck through a hole in a stone axe to remove the blood, and evidently this worked. But starting in the late 17th century, apothecaries and folk healers slowly stopped carrying thunderstones, and the folk beliefs very, very slowly start dying out. So why does this happen, if it's been common in Europe for over 2,000 years by that point? The answer, basically, is that thunderstones began to be recognized for what they really were, Paleolithic tools, and as a result, the world got a whole lot bigger, and the conception of history very slowly started to become a whole lot longer. What kicks off this process is, in a word, Columbus. It's sort of peppered throughout the whole book, but a common theme in Mark Greengrass's Christendom Destroyed is just how much the religious challenge of Martin Luther and the Protestant Reformation meshed with the intellectual and geographical challenge of Christopher Columbus and the discovery, to Europe anyway, of the Americas, which really, really shook the mental framework of Europeans to the core. Going along with that was a challenge to how Europeans, and really more than that, how Christendom itself, understood the past, stemming from, among other things, cabinets of curiosity. So these were not actually cabinets in the way that we understand them. A cabinet in this period actually referred to an entire room. And if you had a cabinet of curiosities, it means you had a room full of just stuff. Everything from geology, so like rocks and petrified wood, to artifacts to supernatural stuff like, you guessed it, thunderstones. This is partly how museums, in their modern form, began. And sometimes those cabinets featured stone tools that Native Americans were observed to be using and which were brought back to Europe and placed in these collections. And wouldn't you know it, some of those Native American stone tools looked an awful lot like some of these thunderstones. But this was not exactly a linear process. This is where we briefly need to talk about one of the major advances in archaeology, and that's what's known as the three-age system. So if you're interested in history or archaeology, and if you made it to this point in the video, or if you watch this channel regularly, I would assume that you are, you know what this is, although you might not be aware of the formal name. Essentially, this is the system used to divide the past up into categories based on the major type of technology used during certain periods. Typically, it's iron, bronze, and stone, getting older in that order, hence the three-age system: Iron Age, Bronze Age, and Stone Age. And generally speaking, this is the development of a 19th century Danish archaeologist and museum curator named C.J. Thomsen, who was in charge of the Museum of Northern Antiquities in Copenhagen, Denmark. Thomsen was trying to categorize and organize the artifacts that were in the museum, and he was using the reports of the early archaeologists who dug this stuff up to help him do that job. And eventually, what happens is he realizes that the iron artifacts belong to this date, and the bronze ones belong to that date, and the stone ones belong to some other date. And although you might find stone stuff in the early bronze layer, or you might find bronze stuff in the early iron layer, the reverse is not true. You don't find iron stuff in the early bronze layers, and certain stretches of time seem to correspond to the use of specific materials. He basically proposes that the stone tools are extremely old, possibly older than anyone had thought. This idea was, in many ways, sort of the culmination of a series of investigations conducted since the 1600s into the nature of thunderstones and the realization that the past was much deeper than had previously been assumed. So what does this look like? Well, this is where we go back to the Cabinet of Curiosities and to someone who potentially figured out the three-age system 200 years or so before C.J. Thomsen, and his name is Michel Mercati. He was trained as a physician, taking degrees in medicine and philosophy from the University of Pisa, and he was the head of the Papal Botanical Gardens in Rome for much of the 1500s. He was deeply, deeply interested in natural philosophy, which is normally what the early modern period called people we would understand today to be scientists. It was not a bracketed off sort of discipline, like today we understand that if someone is a paleontologist, they have a very different skill set and type of knowledge than, say, a cosmologist. Natural philosophers have their own specific interests, that's true, but the term generally applied to everything from the study of what becomes physics and chemistry to nature and archaeology. Mercati, specifically, was really interested in thunderstones. 16th and then 17th century philosophers had studied thunderstones, and they did notice that many of them bore some sort of resemblance to metal tools, like axes and chisels and hammers and arrowheads, but it was still generally thought that they fell from the sky during thunderstorms. Some of these natural philosophers, though, like Anselmus de Boot, proposed that, well, no, actually, perhaps these really are tools, but they were originally made of iron, and they are so old that they had not rusted, but rather they had petrified over centuries or millennia into stone. So there were indications that the thinking was slowly heading in the correct direction here, but it was extremely slow. There was as of yet zero conception that the tools in question were hundreds of thousands of years old or even millions, but de Boot and others did not think it was realistic that a heavy stone could be formed in the sky, and then moved some distance through the air to then land somewhere else. It just didn't make sense. Stones were simply too heavy. Mercati, though, had the truly novel idea because he suggested that no, actually these are tools made of stone, not tools made of metal that had petrified, and definitely not stones that had fallen to earth from the sky. Because he was the keeper of the papal botanical gardens, he had access to the Vatican's collection of artifacts and other collections in Rome itself, more than other natural philosophers of the time did. And towards the end of his life, this enabled him to write this massive study on geological phenomena, and one chapter in particular was dedicated to thunderstones, which he noted, much like others, were often similar in shape to axes and hammerheads. And then there were also thunderstones that looked an awful lot like projectile points. What Mercati did was draw on biblical passages referring to tools made of stone used by the ancient Hebrews to perform circumcision, and he makes the argument that, well, if the ancient Hebrews used blades made of stone, and if we're getting stone tools from the Americas that look suspiciously like thunderstones, then maybe they don't actually fall from the sky. Maybe they're instead actually ancient stone tools. But why would ancient people have used stone tools? Well, here again he draws on the Bible, stating that the Bible tells us that Tubal-Cain was the first blacksmith, who created bronze items, and because Tubal-Cain was several generations removed from Cain, who with his brother Abel were the first sons of Adam and Eve, then in the intervening time, people must have used tools made from stone. And then, after the flood of Noah, some people had lost the technology of metallurgy, so they turned back to stone, which explains why there are all these things that look like stone tools that have been collected over the centuries. His reasoning was very much in line with an understanding of the Earth's history as derived from the Bible. Despite this novel interpretation, though, his ideas don't appear to have been widely disseminated, because for whatever reason his book wasn't published for over a century, until 1717. But in the intervening time, more people were starting to come to this conclusion independently. As more and more tools were brought back from the Americas, and as more and more formal museums were developed, such as the Ashmolean Museum in Oxford, the thinking on the origin of thunderstones began to shift away from supernatural origins and towards the belief that they were indeed stone tools, but their origin was still thought to be relatively recent. When Robert Plot took over as keeper of the Ashmolean Museum in 1683, he began work on a natural history of the region, and he recognized that thunderstones were stone tools, but in terms of age, he dated them to Roman or pre-Roman times. In other words, maybe 2,000-ish years before he was writing. Even more evidence for the ancient use of stone tools came from France, where in 1685, workers digging for stone for a construction project near the town of Cultural actually dug so deep that they stumbled upon a tomb that had been buried deep in the earth. It had 20 skeletons in it, and several stone weapons, notably spear points and axe heads, some of which had holes in them through which a haft could be inserted. Natural philosophers were sent to the site in order to investigate it, and they concluded that whatever this was, and whoever these people were, it was all very clearly ancient, perhaps more ancient than anyone had previously thought. This is essentially how thunderstones came to be understood not as natural phenomena, but as ancient stone tools, and the process continued through the 18th century and into the 19th. The belief fully declines and then goes away in large part because of the development of geology as a scientific discipline, particularly with the work of Charles Lyell. In 1863, he published Geological Evidences of the Antiquity of Man, which combined advances in geology, notably the concept of ice ages and remarkably slow changes in the surface of the Earth, with new ideas about evolution and with ideas about these stone tools and conceptions of prehistoric man, which more and more data was beginning to make almost unassailable. Thunderstones as talismans and natural objects died out by the end of the 19th century, and these objects were recognized for what they were: evidence of human history that extends beyond anything anyone had previously thought, and to the realization that anatomically modern humans are hundreds of thousands of years old, and the tools of whom speak to a history so ancient that at the time it was realized, could scarcely be believed.